Do you have anyone interesting in your family tree? Yeah, me neither. Although he is the last son of Krypton, Superman actually has a pretty detailed and expansive family tree. I'm Andrew Boyd, and today on Top 10 Nerd, I will be attempting to explain Superman's family tree. We'll be bouncing between continuities a bit, and the list is extensive, so for the sake of my sanity, we are not talking about any clones or alternate Earths. Just the family members bound together by blood or adoption. It's a lot to get through, so let's jump right in, starting with the House of El. This family tree is pretty extensive, so we're just going to stick with Earth 1 for this section. Although very little is known about them, Superman's most distant ancestors on the planet Krypton were Feln, his son Rugad, and his son Tomnu. No information is available on these ancestors, but Tomnu's son Arok is the first ancestor of note. Arok the Magnificent was a warlord who brought civilization to the planet Krypton with the help of a potion of strength. His magnificent strength caused enemy soldiers to pledge fealty to him as they believed he was a god. In his final military campaign against the warlord Uved, he kidnapped Uved's daughter Milia in hopes of forcing a peaceful surrender. Milia fell in love with Erok, and the two were married and named Bethgar and Bithgar of Eureka. A quick explanation of that: a Bethgar and a Bithgar are the equivalent to a governor and a governess, and Eureka was a large continent on the planet Krypton. They had a child who they named Kal, which is Kryptonian for child, and the family adopted the surname El, which means of the star. Kal-El the First grew up to be the second Bethgar of Eureka. The Els ruled for over 20 generations, being mostly benign rulers with a few tyrants thrown into the mix to keep people on their toes. The next El whose name we know was Wabel, a tyrannic Bethgar. Wabel had two sons, Vadel and Hyrel. Vardel became the next tyrannical Bethgar, and after a quarrel between the two brothers, Hyrel was forced to flee his homeland. He had two sons, Japhel and Tyoel. Japhel was a prophet for the god Roa, who predicted a great flood that would smite all the wicked Kryptonians while sparing the righteous, making him Noah in space! When the flood came, Tio, who by the way was a zoologist, called down winged beasts to save the people. Japhel, Tyoel, and the survivors then set upon rebuilding their society, but not before Japhel made another prophecy predicting Krypton's eventual doom. Tyoel had descendants such as Bur-El, who was the friend of an inventor, Kilgore. Kilgore invented several important things on Krypton, such as the compass and the hourglass, the latter of which he invented so that the Kryptonians could keep track of the tides in order to dive off of cliffs into the water to harvest an algae called silten, before the Drotho, a bunch of giant birds, could beat them to the edible plant life. When no one else had faith in the old man's invention, Bur-El tested the hourglass by diving off the cliffs, proving that they had kept accurate time. Bur-El soon married Kilgore's daughter, Wedna, and they had two children, Tro-El and Val-El. Val-El was a great explorer who set out across the Dandahu Ocean and discovered Vathlo Island. His troubled brother was a member of his crew who eventually led a mutiny against Val-El. When this failed, Tro-El and his men were left on an uncharted island which became Bokos, the Island of Thieves. One of Val-El's descendants was an astronomer named Sol-El, who invented the telescope just in time to discover a starship coming towards Krypton. Krypton's first encounter with alien life resulted in the planet being enslaved by a race called the Vrangs. His son, Hatuel, led the slave revolt against the aliens and went on to invent the electric motor and the electromagnet. Hatuel's descendants included an inventor named Wirel, who invented Krypton's first audio recording equipment, and a scientist named Shuel, who was a respected mathematician and computer theorist. He had a daughter named Fedra Shuel, a legislator, and a son named Tharel, who reformed Krypton's criminal justice system. His son, Plen-El, was a respected novelist whose son Noxel was Krypton's greatest musical theater star. After this brief generational stop in showbiz, Noxel's son Phil-El became a gifted surgeon who pioneered several Kryptonian medical techniques. His son, Sorn-El, was an agriculturist who helped end world hunger on his planet. His son, Im-El, was an atomic scientist who revolutionized Krypton's industry standards. He had two sons, Pir-El and Yu-El. Yu-El was an influential priest, and Pir-El was the commander of the Kandor Kryptonopolis forces during the planet's last war, which he ended by developing a chemical weapon that made the opposing army become passive and interested in pursuing peace. His son, Tala-El, was one of the founding members of the Kryptonian Science Council, which united all of the separate nations of Krypton under one government, and he actually wrote the planet's constitution. His sons, Pim-El and Gam-El, were a detective and an architect who teamed up to stop a plot to sabotage the rebuilding of Krypton's capital city, Kryptonopolis. Gam-El had a son, Var-El, who figured out interstellar travel without the use of a spaceship and journeyed to Earth, where he was stranded and eventually died. This inspired his son, a scientist named Jor-El the First, to develop an experimental hyperspace rocket and go to Earth to study the planet, taking extensive notes. Jor-El the First had 3 children with his wife, Nimda Andor, 2 of whom are very important to the Superman mythos. Getting the less important sibling out of the way, we have Nim-El, who was a weapons manufacturer. He was present in the city of Kandor when it was shrunk and put in a bottle by the villain Brainiac. He and his wife, Dondra Clutan's son, Don-El, became the police chief of the Bottle City until they were freed by Superman. He went on to create a new Kandor city on an outer dimensional world called Rokin. Another of Jor-El the First's sons was Zor-El, another scientist. When his brother discovered Krypton's impending doom, he tried to build a rocket for himself, but ran out of time. When Krypton was destroyed, Zor-El's home, Argo City, was left intact and hurtled through space with its inhabitants. He married a woman named Allura Inzi, but they soon discovered that Argo City was turning into kryptonite. Zor-El managed to delay the city's demise by covering the planet in a lead shield. This shielding held for many years until a meteor shower caused its destruction, resulting in kryptonite radiation flooding the city. In order to save the life of his teenage daughter, Kara Zor-El, Zor-El placed Kara in a spaceship and sent it to Earth. Once the rocket was away, he managed to save several Kryptonian lives by transporting them into a dimension similar to the Phantom Zone, which he called the Survival Zone. They were trapped there for many years before eventually being rescued by Supergirl. Zor-El and his wife then joined the Kandorians on Rokin. Their daughter, Kara Zor-El, is of course Supergirl. When she came to Earth, Superman agreed to train her to be a superhero, but weirdly made her live in an orphanage instead of letting her stay on his couch or in the Fortress of Solitude. She was eventually adopted by Fred and Edna Danvers, a rocket scientist and his wife, who had lost their son Jan and were hoping to adopt a child to help with their loneliness. Supergirl became a powerful hero in her own right before eventually dying in a fight with the Anti-Monitor in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and being erased from existence in the ensuing reboot of universes. She was later brought back to existence in the New Earth continuity with a slightly different origin, where she was Lana Lang's foster niece. Okay, so backtracking a bit, the third son of Jor-El the First was Jor-El the Second. Jor-El was a gifted scientist who discovered the Phantom Zone and created the Phantom Zone projector, a device used to banish Krypton's criminals to the interdimensional realm. This secured Jor-El a spot on the Science Council. Due to an accident where a missile test had gone wrong and destroyed the colony on one of Krypton's moons, the Science Council banned all forms of space travel. Believing that Krypton's doom was approaching, Jor-El continued to develop experimental spacecraft in secret, hoping to evacuate the planet. When Krypton's destruction began, Jor-El realized he had run out of time. He and his wife, Lara Lor-Van, the daughter of another Kryptonian scientist named Lor-Van, decided to place their infant son Kal-El in one of the experimental rockets, and using the information collected by Var-El and Jor-El the First, sent Kal to Earth, where he would not only survive, but thrive. They launched the rocket shortly before the planet exploded, killing them and everyone else on Krypton. Kal-El's rocket got to Earth, where it landed in Smallville, Kansas. He was found and adopted by the Kents, which leads us to the Kent family tree. The Kent family tree can be traced back to 6th century England, where a feudal lord named Sir Edmund Kent was killed in a jousting tournament by the evil Sir Oswald Bane. His son, Brian, inherited his lands and trained under a knight named Sir Grot, who trained him to be a fierce and cunning warrior. Fearing that Sir Bane would consider him a threat if he knew how skilled Kent was, he pretended to be meek and unskilled. One day, while in the Forest Perilous, he discovered a silver suit of armor, as well as a sword, shield, and a helmet which could conceal his identity. He donned the armor and became known as the Silent Knight, a heroic knight who never spoke and fought Sir Bane's forces. He had many adventures, sometimes working with King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, before eventually retiring and marrying Lady Celia Penbrook. The next known member of the Kent family tree is an American print shop owner from the 1800s named Silas Kent. He had two brothers, Ethan and William, but they're not really notable. Silas and his wife Abigail had 8 children: Belinda, Emma Lou, Jeb, Joel William, Jonathan, Lucy, and Owen. Silas was originally from Boston, but moved with his family to Lawrence, Kansas. Silas was a staunch abolitionist, which put him on the bad side of many of the locals, including a man named Luther Reed, with whom he got into frequent fights. Luther tried to run Silas and his family out of town, but Silas stood firm. When Silas discovered that pro-slavery legislators had rigged a territorial election, Silas used his printing press to print the entire Declaration of Independence on the front page of the town's newspaper. That night, Silas was shot by persons unknown, although many suspected Luther Reed to be the guilty party. Silas's son Jeb accused Luther of murdering his father and vowed revenge. This threat was pretext enough for the corrupt local sheriff to arrest Jeb with the intention of hanging him. He was rescued by his brother Nate. Jeb had a child named Taylor with a woman named Lily Beaumont, but he eventually joined up with the Jesse James gang. His brother Nate was eventually forced to bring him to justice, which resulted in a gunfight where Jeb and his gang were all killed. Nate married a woman named Mary and had children, which eventually led to the birth of their descendant, Sam Kent. Very little is known about Sam Kent, but in Superman Birthright number 3, Martha Kent describes him as a spiteful, needy man who worked hard to make his son feel stupid and insecure, although in this book he is referred to as Matthew Kent, so we'll have to pardon the continuity gaffe. In my opinion, Mark Waid is the best comic book writer of his generation, so I'll give him a pass. This time. Anyways, Sam had 2 sons named Harry and Jonathan, with a wife whose name we don't know. Harry was married to a woman named Sarah, but he died in an accident on the Kent farm when he fell under a thresher. Jonathan and his wife Martha were the couple that found the rocket that Kal-El came to Earth in, and they became his adoptive parents. Hey, Batman's mom is named Martha too! What a random coincidence that I hope is never an important plot point in a movie. Anyways, Jonathan and Martha named the baby Clark Kent, and they were instrumental in teaching him right from wrong, as well as helping him deal with his developing powers. Clark Kent, of course, grew up to be Superman, the Man of Steel. He had a few different love interests over the years, such as Lana Lang, but he eventually married his fellow reporter at the Daily Planet, Lois Lane, which brings us to the Lane family tree. This DC Comics family tree is mercifully much easier to keep track of, although there is some variation depending on which continuity you're working off of. In the Earth 1 continuity, Sam Lane and his wife Ella are the owners of a horse farm in Pittsdale, Iowa. In the New Earth continuity, Sam Lane is a general in the United States Army who had 2 daughters with his wife Ella. He had wanted sons and as a result was cold and distant, forcing his children to do extensive combat training and apparently treating them more like soldiers than his children. He was an enemy of Superman, believing that it was only a matter of time before Superman would turn on humanity. He faked his own death, appearing to sacrifice himself to defeat the villain Imperiex, but was later revealed to be alive and working with Lex Luthor in a secret government facility that is overseeing the actions of the villain Brainiac. After he used the villain Reactron to kill the recently freed Kandorians in the new Krypton story, his daughter Lois called him a monster, and the files proving his involvement were leaked online by Jimmy Olsen. He then took his own life to avoid the shame of being arrested and taken before an international court. In the Earth 2 continuity, his daughter Lucy is married to a man named George Tompkins and has a daughter named Susie, who is a precocious child who tends to make her Aunt Lois's life as difficult as possible. In the Earth 1 continuity, Lucy Lane is a flight attendant who is the on-again, off-again girlfriend of Jimmy Olsen. In the New Earth continuity, she was still a flight attendant until she was blinded in a hijacking. She became depressed and tried to jump off a roof, but was rescued by Bizarro. Bizarro had a weird powder coating his body, which somehow restored Lucy's sight. Like her Earth 1 counterpart, she dated Jimmy Olsen for a while, but eventually broke up with him and started dating another Daily Planet reporter named Ron Troop. Lucy became pregnant and married Ron, eventually giving birth to a son named Sam Troop. After Sam Lane faked his death, she joined the military and eventually was brought into Sam's inner circle in an attempt to deal with the new Kryptonians from Kandor. Sam outfitted Lucy with a mystical suit which granted her powers, making her Superwoman. Posing as a Kryptonian, she infiltrated the Kryptonians, killing several of them. She was defeated by Supergirl and taken into custody, whereupon Lois disowned her as family. Which brings us to Lois. The older daughter of Sam and Ella, Lois Lane had no greater desire than to be a journalist. In the Earth 1 continuity, when Lois was in high school, she entered a contest being held by the Daily Planet, where whoever submitted the best news report would be awarded a job at the planet once they came of age. She found herself in competition with a young Clark Kent, and the two uncovered an evil scheme by a villain named Paul Corey. Lois submitted her report and won the competition. After graduating high school and minoring in journalism at Raleigh College, Lois was hired by the planet and became one of its best reporters. In the New Earth continuity, she visited the Daily Planet when she was 15, lied about her age, claiming to be 19, and asked Perry White for a job. Lucy spoiled her ruse, but Lois was undeterred, breaking into LexCorp to try and find a scoop good enough to warrant being given a job at the prestigious paper. Luthor caught her and had her searched, but she managed to hide an important paper in her mouth, gave it to Perry White, and was given the job. She and Clark Kent eventually got together, and he trusted her enough to marry her and reveal his secret Superman identity to her. The two were married for years, and briefly adopted General Zod's son Lor-Zod, who they named Christopher Kent, but this was cut short when Chris was pulled into the Phantom Zone while helping Superman to defeat the General and his forces. Lois and Clark eventually had a biological child who they named John. At the age of 10, John began fighting crime with his father as the new Superboy. John became best friends with Damian Wayne, and the two became the Super Sons. After a journey through space with his time-displaced grandfather, John crash-landed on Earth 3 and was kept prisoner in a volcano for several years by the villain Ultraman. John eventually escaped and found his way home, where he discovered that what had been several years for him was only a few weeks on Earth. When his father left Earth to fight alien threats, John became the new Superman. Well, that's everyone. Who is your favorite Superman ancestor? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more Top 10 Nerd.